On a stormy night in April, the small town of Kirkoswald was thrown into chaos. Hugh and David Kennedy, two local men, led a group of 200 angry and armed villagers into the parish church. They carried spears, guns, and other weapons, their faces twisted with rage. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside the church. The air was thick with tension, and the flickering candles cast eerie shadows on the walls. The crowd was there to make a statement. They were tired of what they saw as unfair treatment, and decided to take matters into their own hands. They gathered on the 8th, 10th, and 11th of April, disrupting the peace of the small community. The parish church, usually a place of quiet reflection, became a battleground. The villagers, who normally numbered just over 1,000, were in an uproar. Hugh and David Kennedy, the leaders of the riot, did something shocking. They irreverently and indecently administered communion, a sacred act that only the church leaders were supposed to perform. This act of defiance sent a clear message: they were not going to back down. The disturbance didn't stay inside the church. The crowd moved to the college at Maybole, a nearby town, where they continued their protest. The noise and chaos could be heard for miles. The local authorities, caught off guard, struggled to regain control. The rioters were eventually brought before the High Court. 3 of the 5 leaders, including Hugh and David Kennedy, were sent to the castle of Dunbarton. The other 2 were held in Edinburgh Castle, their fate left to the Queen's discretion. The Queen Mary had issued a proclamation calling for all Scots to maintain quietness, keep peace, and live in civil society. But the riot showed that not everyone was ready to follow her call. The events in Kirkoswald were not an isolated incident. Similar disturbances were happening across Scotland, reflecting the deep religious and social tensions of the time. Queen Mary, a Catholic, ruled a country that had recently adopted Protestantism as its official religion. The call for civility in her proclamation was a reflection of the ongoing struggle to maintain order. In the town of Stirling, the local church, Stirling Holy Rood, faced its own set of problems. The Kirk Session, a group of church leaders, noticed that the congregation was becoming unruly during communion. People were rushing to the table, spilling wine, and even pushing and shouting as they left the church. The session was concerned and decided to address the issue. The minister was asked to speak about the problem from the pulpit, urging the congregation to be more respectful. The Kirk Session in Stirling was part of a broader effort to maintain order in the church. The Reformed Protestantism that had become the new religion of Scotland was still being established, and the church was working to ensure that people followed the new practices. The session's response to the disorder at Stirling was a reflection of the church's role in maintaining social order. Feud-related violence in kirkyards, the churchyards, became a significant problem in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. In Neilston, Renfrewshire, a man named Archibald Stewart caused a disturbance during prayers on a Friday in January. He attacked James Davidson and others, spoke threatening and boastful words, and even brought pipers to play outside the church door. Stewart and his accomplices later tried to break into Davidson's house with swords. The Privy Council, the highest court in the land, denounced Stewart as a rebel for his actions. The Privy Council's response to Stewart's behavior was harsh. They described him as a godless man who was causing disorder in the country. The council saw his actions as a threat to the Reformed Church and the community. Stewart's case was one of many that highlighted the tensions between the old and new religious practices. In the town of Muthill, a village near Stirling, 2 men, John Drummond and Patrick Wilson, fought with drawn swords in the kirkyard. The presbytery, the local church council, was concerned about the disturbance and the impact it had on the congregation. They summoned Drummond and Wilson to the church to face discipline, emphasizing the importance of maintaining order and respect in the community. The Kirk Sessions, like the one in Muthill, played a crucial role in resolving feuds and maintaining order. In Dundonald, Ayrshire, a Kirk Session heard a case of kirkyard violence between John Dickey and Simon Wallace. The session investigated the matter for 5 months, trying to understand the motivations behind the fight. They worked to reconcile the conflicting parties, emphasizing the importance of peace and respect in the community. The Kirk Sessions were not just places of worship, but also centers of community life. They had the power to discipline and reconcile, and their influence was felt in even the smallest and most rural parishes. The Kirk session in Burntisland on the south coast of Fife codified their acts and statutes, prohibiting all forms of disturbance in the church. They imposed fines and required public repentance, showing the importance they placed on maintaining order. The Privy Council, while a higher authority, did not differ much in its approach to maintaining order. Henry Sinclair of Whitekirk, Lothian, interrupted a church service, brandishing weapons and threatening the minister. The council denounced him as a rebel, emphasizing the ungodliness of his actions and the danger they posed to the community. The most high-profile case of kirkyard violence involved the Home and Cockburn families in the Borders. David and Sir George Home, members of a prominent family, led a group that vandalized the church and physically attacked the Cockburn brothers during a service. The Privy Council sentenced David Home to imprisonment for his role in the disturbance, highlighting the severity of the incident. These incidents, from the riots in Kirkoswall to the fights in kirkyards, show the deep tensions and conflicts that existed in Scotland during this time. The Church, through its Kirk sessions and the Privy Council, worked to maintain order and resolve disputes, but the underlying issues of religion, social change, and personal feuds continued to simmer. The Home family, known for their feuds, found themselves in trouble again in 1625. This time, George Home and his son Alexander, along with some friends, tried to destroy James Mowat's seat and desk in a church. The attack was interrupted, but the Homes didn't stop there. They stayed the night at Gordon, drinking and cursing, and then tried to destroy Mowat's seat again. When they appeared before the church session, they were ordered to repent in front of the congregation, but they refused to do so properly. The Privy Council, which was like a high court, declared the 4 men who didn't show up for the hearing as rebels. Feuds were common in Scotland, especially in the Borders area, which was known for its lawlessness. By 1625, the Borders had become more peaceful, but the Home family continued to cause trouble. This suggests that the nature of the Home clan itself might have been a big part of the problem. In both England and Scotland, church seats were important. In England, the seats often reflected social status, but in Scotland, this wasn't as clear. People brought their own seats to church after 1560, and the more important people could place theirs in better spots. This sometimes led to disputes, but these were usually between people of similar social standing. The violence and feuds changed over time. For example, in 1630, James Crichton of Friendraft had a run-in with John, the Bishop of the Isles, at the little kirk in Edinburgh. Crichton was sitting quietly when the bishop confronted him angrily. The bishop tried to hit Crichton with a knife, but ended up knocking off his hat. The congregation was shocked, and the council later found that Crichton had caused the problem by blocking the bishop's path. Since the bishop was a clergyman, the council referred the matter to the Ecclesiastical High Commission. This incident might have been related to a long-standing feud between the Crichtons of Friendraft and the Gordons of Rothamay. Earlier that year, the Crichtons' tower had been set on fire, and the Privy Council spent years investigating the incident. Charles I even asked a committee to look into it weekly, which led to John Meldrum being executed for his role in the fire. In 1631, the Privy Council heard a case about a dispute over church seating in Old Rain, a village near Aberdeen. Adam Abercrombie found John Leith already in his desk and suggested they share it, but Leith refused and tried to start a fight. The next week, several men came to the church armed with weapons to prevent Alexander Abercrombie from taking his seat. The minister had to cancel the service because of the disturbance. One of the men, William Erskine, even harassed Alexander Abercrombie at his house. Despite a thorough investigation, the council acquitted Erskine because they needed him to admit his fault to prove the Abercrombies' case. The Old Rain incident was a local feud between ordinary people, but it showed that the council was concerned about proper behavior, especially on Sundays. The council described the Abercrombies' behavior as Christian, and the others as unchristian. In 1637, Charles I tried to impose Anglican worship practices in Scotland, leading to the famous St. Giles riot in Edinburgh. The story goes that a market woman named Jenny Geddes threw her stool at the dean when he started reading from the new prayer book. The crowd was angry and called the bishop names like Antichrist and Beastly Belagod. They attacked anyone who responded to the liturgy and chased the bishop out of the church, throwing mud at him. Jenny Geddes, whether real or symbolic, represented the ordinary Scots who were against the new prayer book. The presence of women at the forefront of the riot showed that the protesters were not just a small group of rebels, but a significant part of the population. The Privy Council received many complaints about the new prayer book, and the riot highlighted the widespread dissent. The violence at St. Giles shared similarities with earlier feud violence, such as occurring during a service and involving church furniture. The 1640s were a tumultuous time in Scotland. In 1640, Jonnet MacFarland, a servant, attacked a madwoman during a Sunday service in Stirling. The session punished MacFarland by making her perform public repentance, dressed in white sheets with bare head and feet. The incident might not have been a feud, but it showed that violence in church was still a problem. In 1642, a more serious incident occurred at the Kirk of Stonykerk in Galloway. The presbytery had suspended the minister, Gilbert Power, but the General Assembly reinstated him. When a minister from Maybole came to announce this, a group of protesters from nearby villages, led by the brother of the Laird of Fruch, entered the church armed with stones and cudgels. They accused the minister of being a soul murderer and refused to listen to the service. The violence continued outside, with mud being thrown and a parishioner injured. The next day, one of the rioters, Andrew MacDougall, threatened to kill Gilbert Power. The Privy Council saw this as both a religious and a civil issue, emphasizing the importance of the General Assembly's decision. The council punished the rioters by having some of them jailed and requiring a large caution to ensure they would help reinstate Gilbert Power. The Stonykerk incident showed that the council was concerned about maintaining order and proper behavior, especially in remote areas. The council's use of terms like barbarous and unchristian highlighted their view that the rioters' behavior was unacceptable, both in terms of religious and civil standards. In the 1600s, church wasn't always a peaceful place. It was a central part of people's lives, where they not only worshipped, but also resolved disputes and managed community affairs. Sometimes, these activities led to arguments and even fights. One such case happened in 1648 at the South Leith Church in Scotland. On a Sunday morning in July, Florence Jameson and her husband, James Steinson, had a big argument over a church seat. The fight got so heated that James Steinson filed a complaint 2 days later. He said that Jameson and his wife, along with their servants, had been abusive about the seat on June 29th and July 2nd. The church leaders, called the Kirk session, decided to stop both families from sitting in that seat until they could sort out the issue. On July 27th, both families admitted they were wrong and apologized, but the details of what happened came out on August 20th through witness reports. A 28-year-old man named John Smith recalled that Jameson's wife called Steinson's wife too proud to sit in that seat and a godless woman. Jameson entered the church in a rage and took the seat. When Steinson tried to take it back, Jameson hit him so hard that Steinson's hat fell off. Jameson even swore an oath, saying he would make an example of Steinson if it happened again. The church leaders found Jameson guilty of several serious offenses, causing a big scandal by hitting Steinson, abusing Steinson's wife, swearing, and breaking the Sabbath. Jameson's wife and servant were also found guilty of breaking the Sabbath by insulting Steinson. Steinson was only found guilty of breaking the Sabbath. Jameson eventually gave up his claim to the seat on July 13, 1649. But even after all this, Jameson asked the church for a seat in 1657. This shows that while the fight over the seat was resolved, the community's expectations for respectful behavior in church were very high. This incident in South Leith is a good example of how church seating disputes could turn violent. In earlier times, during King James VI's rule, such disputes sometimes led to people destroying church seats or even brandishing weapons. In the Jameson and Steinson case, the violence was mostly in words, but it still showed how serious these disputes could be. Historians have often thought that blood feuds and violent disputes were declining in Scotland by the 1650s. However, cases like the one in South Leith suggest that these feuds were not completely gone. The violence in the church was less severe than in the past, but it still showed that people were passionate about their status and honor, even in sacred spaces. The church leaders took these disputes very seriously. They recorded them in great detail and followed up on them, showing how important it was to maintain order and godly behavior. This is different from how they handled simple Sabbath breaches, which were often recorded briefly. The nature of violence in the church also changed over time. In the earlier part of the 1600s, fights often involved weapons and destruction. By the 1640s, the violence was more about aggressive words and physical confrontations. This change shows how society was evolving, but it also highlights that religious and social tensions were still very much present. Religious violence wasn't just about personal disputes. It often happened during times of religious change and conflict. For example, when King Charles I tried to enforce certain religious practices, it led to a lot of resistance and violence. The church was a focal point for these tensions, and the authorities had to work hard to maintain order. In the 1640s and 1650s, during the Civil Wars, the church became even more of a battleground. People were fighting over control and religious practices, and the military sometimes had to step in to keep the peace. This period of violence and disruption has not been fully explored by historians, and it's important to understand how it affected communities. Overall, the church in the 1600s was a place where people's religious and social lives intersected. It was a space where conflicts could arise, and where the community had to work together to resolve them. The South Leith case shows that even in a time of change, people still valued their status and the respect of their peers, and they were willing to fight for it, even if it meant breaking the rules of the church. In the decades leading up to the English Civil War, the church was a hub of community life, but it was also a place where tensions often boiled over into violence. The records from the Borthwick Institute, which cover the years between 1558 and 1640, show that serious physical violence in the Diocese of York was relatively rare, happening on average only once every 3 years. However, the frequency of these incidents varied. The 1590s and the 1630s saw more disturbances, with 2/3 of the cases involving fights between laypeople in the church or churchyard, and about 1/3 involving attacks on clergy or other church officials. Most of the people involved were men, but women were also part of these conflicts, making up about 1/3 of the participants. The 1590s were particularly turbulent. There were instances of ministers being pushed out of chapels by groups of women, intimidated, or subjected to cruel pranks. These incidents highlighted the growing tensions within the community and the church. In Somerset, between 1600 and 1640, the Quarter Sessions local courts dealt with various church-related disputes. These included arguments over seating arrangements, disagreements about church rates or tithes, and cases of verbal or physical abuse of clergy. Over 40 years, 2 clergy members faced threats of violence. 1 was physically attacked, and 3 were accused of assault themselves. Even minor offenses, like kissing during worship, leaving the church mid-sermon, or calling out from a window during a service, were taken seriously and reported to the Quarter Sessions. Another common issue was the introduction of pews, which were meant to promote order and discipline. Instead, they often led to conflicts over seating rights. People felt a sense of ownership over their pews, and disputes over seating arrangements known as pew rage became a significant source of tension. For example, in 1633, a man in Lancashire was involved in a fight over a pew bench, and the Bishop of Winchester commented on the frequency of such disputes. By the 1630s, disagreements over religious practices and beliefs were intensifying. These tensions often simmered beneath the surface, as recorded in the diary of Robert Woodford, a steward in Northamptonshire. However, they occasionally erupted into more visible conflicts. In 1634, at the parish of St. Peter le Bailey in Oxford, a violent fight broke out between those celebrating May Day and Puritans who opposed such traditional festivities. The situation escalated dramatically after 1640, with the start of the English Civil War. The Long Parliament's campaign against the existing ecclesiastical order led to violent acts of iconoclasm and attacks on conservative churchmen. In areas of radical activism, like London and Essex, these acts were particularly common. Soldiers and Puritan factions disrupted services, burned prayer books, and arrested clergy suspected of royalist sympathies. One vivid example comes from the letters of Nehemiah Wharton, a parliamentary soldier. He described how his men would taunt suspect clergy, such as when they brought in an old base priest from Sow and led him around the town in a mocking parade. In Kensworth, Bedfordshire, a parish known for its radicalism, The incumbent John Siddall was dragged out of the church by 2 parishioners and died 2 months later from his injuries. The parish later paid compensation to his widow, possibly out of remorse. As the Civil War raged, church courts often ceased to function, and quarter sessions were disrupted. However, evidence from various sources, including parliamentary records, shows that violent conflicts continued to occur within parish churches. In March 1646, at Wimborne Minster in Dorset, supporters of the displaced incumbent William Stone objected to his replacement, Thomas Ford, and cried out for their doctor and the old service, even in the presence of soldiers. In Thaxted, Essex, the appointment of a new minister by Lady and Lord Maynard sparked a riot. When the mayor and the new minister, Mr. Hall, arrived at the church, a group of sequestrators challenged his authority, leading to a violent confrontation where women played a significant role. The mayor allegedly remarked, "Let them alone and let the women decide the case." In August 1647, an armed confrontation between parishioners and soldiers at Fisherton Anger in Wiltshire resulted in several men being imprisoned and accused of murder. Similar incidents were reported across the country, with Essex being particularly active in replacing ministers. In March 1645, at Headingham Sibyl, a group of laborers sang a psalm contrary to the one set by the parish clerk, and the justice of the peace was forced to leave the church. In July 1645, Richard Claydon, the new minister at Great Easton, was assaulted and beaten when he tried to collect tithes. Sussex also saw its share of turmoil. In November 1645, the new incumbent at Ardingly, John Brand, was assaulted in the churchyard. At East Grinstead, in April 1646, a group of people, including their wives, attacked the new incumbent, Stephen Watkins, in the church. The following month, Robert Godden, the vicar of Iffield, was accused of wounding Humphrey Waller in the churchyard. In Lancashire, in July 1647, James Hall, a clerk, feared for his safety from James Boker and his wife. In Crixeath, Wales, in June 1648, William Pierce, a clerk, was in fear of Robert Gruffydd and his wife. In Devon, the new ministers faced resistance, and in February 1647, the sequestered incumbent at Paynton, David Davies, was let off after disturbing his replacement during a service. Many of these incidents involve people of various social statuses, from laborers to yeomen, and women often played a vocal role. The conflicts were not just about power and authority, but also about deeply held religious beliefs. Some incidents were linked to a campaign encouraging parishioners to withhold tithes, fueled by the rumor that Thomas Fairfax would reinstate loyalist clergy. The ban on the prayer book, enacted by Parliament, was a significant source of conflict. In Thorpe-le-Soken, Essex, in June 1645, 3 men interrupted a prayer book service and threatened to remove the reader. At Peterborough Cathedral, the congregation's pressure to continue using the prayer book led to a similar outburst in January 1647. In August 1647, reports suggested that all of Cornwall was trying to return to traditional practices, leading to physical confrontations. One of the most outrageous incidents occurred in Bath in April 1648, where a former royalist captain, Henry Chapman, invited a clergyman to read from the prayer book in St. James Church. The service was guarded by 100 armed men, and the event caused significant fear among the local authorities. Even in 1649, the prayer book remained a contentious issue. In September of that year, at St. Peter's Paul's Wharf in London, a troop of horsemen arrested a minister using the prayer book, resulting in a violent confrontation where people were trampled and injured. The incident was seen as a provocation, and it ended in disaster. In more remote areas, traditional practices continued in secret, with some clergy memorizing the prayer book and serving it piecemeal. However, those who were caught following traditional practices risked being prosecuted or ejected. Parliament remained firmly opposed to the prayer book, and efforts to print it in a smaller, more discreet form were suppressed. Despite the risks, some traditionalists continued to meet in secret, often with the support of sympathetic congregations. However, these activities were not prosecuted as rigorously as nonconformist meetings were after the Restoration. The church, once a place of worship and community, had become a battleground for the religious and political struggles of the time. The conflicts within its walls reflected the broader tensions tearing the country apart. The tensions that simmered beneath the surface of post-Civil War England reveal a society torn between strict Puritan ideals and a resilient, defiant counterculture. Despite the regime's efforts to enforce religious and political stability, many people found ways to express their discontent, often through small acts of rebellion that spoke volumes about the divisions within their communities. One of the most visible signs of this rebellion was the way people defied the strict Sabbath laws. In places like Hampshire, people organized help ales and merry meetings on Sundays, where they drank, danced, and became so rowdy that they were altogether unfit for the duties of that day. These gatherings were more than just celebrations. They were a way for people to assert their independence from the puritanical rules that sought to control every aspect of their life. In Sutton, a group of people from Chester spent an entire Saturday night partying with music and dancing, and when someone tried to complain the next day, they were beaten up. The resistance was strongest in what the Puritans called the dark corners of the land, regions like Wales, Cheshire, Lancashire, and Somerset. In Wiveliscombe, a man named William Davie ran through the streets on Sundays, yelling that he could thrust all the independent tubby-preaching rouges out of the town. At Wincanton, when a man named John Lane was put in the stocks for swearing, the townspeople celebrated with feasting and singing, and Lane himself sang lewd songs while in the stocks. The churchwarden and tithingmen even joined in. The authorities struggled to maintain order, especially in rural areas where traditional festivities and wakes were deeply ingrained. In Ashwater, Devon, the constables were fined for allowing a maypole in the parish, and in Hapsford, Cheshire, a woman named Mary Allerton was found in a secluded area with a stranger on May Day. In Somerset, a Whitsunday skimmington and a mass cudgel fight both defied local orders and ended in violence. Sometimes the resistance was more subtle. In Taxal, Derbyshire, the burial of a loyalist gentlewoman led to local loyalists targeting the teenage sons of a new resident, forcing them to drink toasts to the royalist cause and leaving their home vulnerable. In Pitminster, Somerset, when a man named Edward Buncombe was summoned for not attending church, he sarcastically asked if the summoning courts were up again. A baker in Stockport, when stopped for baking on the Sabbath, replied that though we would not suffer it in our time of constableship, it would not be always. Even when people did attend church, their behavior often defied the spirit of the law. In Tedburn, St. Mary, Devon, people were seen drinking in an alehouse between services, and then coming into the church drunk, disturbing the service. At Stalmine in Lancashire, 2 laborers came into the church, absolutely drunk, and disrupted the sermon, even calling the minister a liar. The churchyard became a gathering place for those who were less devout, a place where they could meet the letter of the law without adhering to its spirit. In Cheshire, people were seen standing and talking in the churchyard, ignoring the warnings of church officers. In Carnarvonshire, armed fights broke out in churchyards, and in Selworthy, Somerset, 2 men threw stones at the church doors during a service. The tension between the new religious order and the old ways often erupted into violence. In Androg, Caernarfonshire, a man was forcibly removed from his seat in the church, and in Marytavy, Devon, a man was thrust from his seat and threatened with a knife. Clergy often felt the need to carry weapons for protection, and there were numerous reports of assaults on ministers and their families. In Fishlake, a laborer terrorized the congregation with long knives, and in Leicester, a group of people tried to force a minister out of the pulpit, calling him a Jesuit and a rogue. The collection of tithes and other dues also sparked conflict. In Stogumber, Somerset, a churchwarden was assaulted when he tried to collect unpaid rates, and in Averton Gifford, Devon, a loyalist faction seized tithes to support their preferred minister. In Tattenhall, Cheshire, a minister faced a faction that refused to attend church while he was in charge, and in Minster, Kent, a minister had to enter the church through the windows to avoid traps set by his opponents. The struggle for control of the pulpit sometimes led to absurd and tragic scenes. In Aldford, Cheshire, 2 ministers physically fought over who would preach, and in Wraxall, Somerset, 3 ministers were present at a service, with one interrupting the others and causing a disturbance. In Offwell, Devon, an ejected loyalist minister preached while the official minister sat weeping, and the loyalist's armed servant protected him. These acts of defiance and violence paint a picture of a society in flux, where the old ways refuse to be completely erased by the new order. The tensions and conflicts of this period show that the road to stability and unity was far from smooth. and that the legacy of the Civil War continued to shape the lives of people for years to come. Despite the efforts of the regime to enforce a strict moral and religious code, the resilience and spirit of the people ensured that their voices would not be silenced.